this area of research has really been looking at essentially the protection and the preservation of freight corridors, and very specifically work has been done that has focused in on freight rail corridors. And the reason why this issue has come to light has been over the 30 years, as many of you have seen, freight has grown tremendously with globalization and with the movement of manufacturing to many places overseas. So it has meant we have had to move a lot more goods on these corridors that previously had essentially not carried as much goods, essentially. And reason why this issue has really come to bear is also at the same time we have been urbanizing. So more and more people within the US and in fact globally have been moving to cities, and that has meant we have often had land uses that have started to come into conflict with one another. Not necessarily by any specific fault or design, but just by the sheer magnitude of circumstances. And it's also become an issue because in many cities, hitherto areas that were very industrialized have been gentrified and have been changing their types of land use over time. But many of these areas still have freight corridors running through them and freight rail yards that are active and that operate on a 24/7 basis. And this is not an issue that speaks to any one area within the US. It's over the entire country, and the research essentially really showcased that this has happened over the entire country. So there's been two pieces of research that we have been involved with here at CTR. The first piece of research was specific looking at rail corridors, and it was for the Texas Department of Transportation, and it was actually entitled Encroachment of Incompatible Land Use Around Rail Corridors. And over the process of conducting that research, we really did discover that this is becoming a problem. And when you don't have strong land use controls and zoning controls, it can become a real issue. And there are sort of the biggest issues that arise is essentially what you could term proximity. So proximity of the freight activity with the land use activity, and especially when that land use activity is a residential activity or a school or a hospital or a library and even emergency services. And it has grown, and in many instances, conflict arises then because obviously the main reason that conflict arises is because of noise and vibration that many people will feel from freight rail trains moving over long distances, etc., and then coming into these areas in which the land use is in proximity essentially, or their type of land use is in proximity. And there are some tools that we have started to look at to essentially redress this issue, and they are outlined in the reports. The second piece of research that was undertaken for the Transportation Research Board, and that was entitled Protecting and Preserving Freight Facilities and Corridors. And so in that, the remit was enlarged to look at more than just the rail corridors. It was also to look at ports and other types of facilities. And in that research, essentially, we also came up with further recommendations for essentially improving this issue, tools that could be used. And to give you an example of what this issue is, this is a couple of pictures of two different places around the country. This is in Baltimore, Maryland. This is an old freight silo. Essentially, this was actually a grain silo for grain, and so it's now a new residential development. But as you can see here, it's right within and around, adjacent to the actual Port of Baltimore, that is a working, active port. This is another example. This is a unit that has been built essentially very, very close to the active rail line. It's actually 8.5 feet from what they call the center line of the rail line to the edge of the building. So it's extremely close. So it's these types of issues that are occurring and coming up, and obviously that can potentially create these conflicts between the freight activity and the rail activity, and essentially you living within a property and being able to enjoy your property. And there are many other examples around the country of other issues like this. So you will often have emergency facilities that are built near to these facilities as well and have to come across grade crossings. Many of you have probably encountered a grade crossing. and they can be extremely dangerous if you are not very careful around them, especially if they are unguarded. And other issues that have come up have been around port facilities. There's plenty of research that's looked at essentially noise around airports as well. Many of these facilities, as you can imagine, they're all 24/7 facilities. They don't stop. So there are also other issues aside from potentially noise and vibration, which is also light, because obviously they have to be lit for security purposes and to be able to carry out their function as a freight facility. And the railroads have begun to become engaged within this, and in fact this was how this video came to be as well, which was the Canadian National Railroad gave the Centre for Transportation Research here at the University of Texas Austin a small grant to continue looking into this issue in this area, and to look at developing some potential models and seeing how GIS could assist in this issue in terms of adding some predictability and overlaying land use zoning with the current usage and with the corridors, and seeing where there might be potential conflicts coming up in the future. And it's been a fascinating look into an issue that will continue as the housing market comes back, as we continue to urbanize, as more and more people move into cities, and as we look for further and greater use of our land within our cities. Which also too does conversely have a benefit to our cities, which is the more we develop our land, the better use we can put land to. We can redevelop old parcels that maybe aren't functional anymore, and that does lead to tax revenues for cities.